So yeah, if somebody that people use people that their choices they
Hold on.
I put
No, no,
go ahead.
I had it muted last time. All right, welcome back. Um, so today I'm going to go over an article the MPU sent me that was relevant to our last conversation, and then I'm going to actually probably put on a video game and listen to our last conversation, kind of critique myself, kind of maybe take notes on what he's saying so that I can come up with research and get a better understanding of what the facts of the matter around whatever we are talking about is. Um, I don't know if I'm gonna go over the whole thing. It is a fuck. It is a 3-hour conversation. I lost about 23 minutes of it because I didn't have the audio going, but that shouldn't be the case today. I also sent out a couple of messages in a couple of discords looking for people conservatives to talk to. I don't know if that's gonna happen or not. Probably not, but yeah. All right. Do, 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 do. I mean, I posted on my Discord. One of the community members say he's not wrong. The only thing I had to do find it. Okay, so he put this link from the Federalist.com, which I don't ever dismiss a source because of where it came from, but I will be much more skeptical of a source if I've had past dealings with it and have found it to be wrong. This one particular source, tried to make the argument that the CDC had previously lied about how many people were hospitalized or contracted myocarditis. Um, but when I looked into what they were talking about and where they got their numbers, which they claim came straight from the CDC, they were comparing the numbers of myocarditis from previous years to the numbers of myocarditis and something called petriocarditis or something like that. Um, that year that the article came out, which was 2022, I believe. And yeah, if you're going to compare one condition to two separate conditions, or of course you're going to get higher numbers when you're with the two separate conditions. Just like something that seems like it'd be obvious. But yeah, I don't ever dismiss sources just based off of where they came from, even if in the past I have had bad dealings with them. But what I will do is I will go through the source and figure out if what they are saying is valid or not. This one right here is about gun control and the Second Amendment. He's making the claim that the Federalist Papers 29 was Hamilton's defense of a federal standing army. His position was not adopted. Here is an article about the actual history and the defense of the individual rights. I'm really curious as to how he thinks that what makes him think that his positions were never adopted, because when you look at the Second Amendment, it says that we are to have a well-regulated militia. Um, well-regulated meaning well-functioning. I do not think that having everybody having weapons and being a part of the militia would be any of the founding fathers' definition of well regulated when in terms of the militia. I don't understand. Like maybe there are quotes where the founding fathers are saying that everyone needs a weapon so they could be a part of the militia. Um, but the only one that I know of is Federalist Paper number 29, which makes the exact opposite argument. In a recent interview with New York Times regarding his upcoming memoir, former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens shares what he contends are the three worst court decisions to come down in his long tenure. His first choice, unsurprisingly, is District of Columbia versus Heller, the 2008 ruling that finally codified the Second Amendment as an individual right. Stephen told the Times that he even took an extraordinary step in trying to head off the decision, preemptively sending the other justices a probable dissent and convince them to change their positions. The combination of its actual practical impact by increasing the use of guns in this country, and also the legal reasoning by which I thought the total unpervasive was totally unpervasive, he says, persuaded me that the case is just about as bad as any in my tenure. Stevens doesn't even attempt to hide his political motivations behind his argument. Earlier this year, in fact, Stevens implored Americans to do what he couldn't while in the court and repeal the Second Amendment. Stevens quotes former Second Chief Justice Berger, who in 1991 claims that activists had perpetrated one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, in American public by special interest groups that I've ever seen in my life. Both these justices relied on an expedited revisionist history to make their claims. This effort was spearheaded by a left wing historian who attempted to retroactively dismiss the unambiguous presence of guns in American life and the role of firearms play in the rise of the nation. It was taken by anti firearm activists and journalists who have used the revisionist history to dismiss the overwhelming evidence that founding generation believed individual Americans had an inherent right to bear those arms. Okay, so the fact that there were a lot of people back then who had firearms is irrelevant to what the Constitution says. The Constitution says the, what it says, and there is a very reasonable interpretation, even by the words of the past, even by the definitions of the words that are in the Constitution that they used when the Constitution was written. There is a very reasonable interpretation of the Second Amendment that says that the right to bear arms is in service of the militia. Like that is a very reasonable interpretation. All these forces fostered a collective right theory regarding the Second Amendment that was normalized in legal and political circles for decades. Countless judges like Stevens latched onto this mythology in an attempt to disarm law abiding individuals in the name of safety. The singular purpose of the Second Amendment, they argued, was to arm militias, not individuals. For some reason, they contended the Second Amendment, unlike most of the Bill of Rights, actually empowered the government rather than the individual. Any other interpretation was antiquated and destructive reading of the past. I'm pretty sure the Second Amendment talks about state rights a lot. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if the Second Amendment was a thing that was ratified in order to clarify the rights of the states. But history has never backed this up backed up this contention. Not then, not now. The nation of individual ownerships of firearms was so unmistakable and so omnipresent in the colonial days and beyond that America saw no more need to debate its existence than they did the right to drink water or breathe the air. Not a single Minuteman was asked to hand his musket over to the Continental Congress after chasing the British back from Boston. If they had been, the revolution would have been short lived indeed. The debate over the Second Amendment centered on who controlled the militias, the federal or state governments. Everyone understood that the militia consisted of free individuals who would almost always grab their own firearms, the ones who they use the ones they used in their everyday existence to engage in concentrated effort to protect themselves, their community, or their country, sometimes from their own government. Many colonies enshrined the individual rights to bear arms in their constitutions before the Bill of Rights was even written, most of them in more explicit individualistic terms, not a single framer objected. I'm sure not a single framer objected. My argument is that the framers intended the the Second Amendment to give states the right to to regulate guns in service of a militia. If a state wanted their militia to be every individual, they had every right to do that. If a state wanted the militia to be a more controlled body of people, then they have the right to do that in the Second Amendment, in the Constitution. And the Second Amendment does not protect everybody, individuals' right to bear arms. I mean, I don't really like every time something comes up when it comes to like a mass shooting, the conservatives will always say this isn't a gun issue, it's a mental health issue. Well, what are you going to do when you find that somebody is mentally incapable of having a gun? You're going to take their guns away. And maybe there is something in the Constitution that I don't know about that allows that. But if you're going to have this rigid interpretation of the Constitution and that's not in there, then you would have to argue that we can't even take guns away from the people who are deemed mentally incapable of having them. The right to self defense is the first law of nature, wrote George Tucker in the 1803 Blackstone's commentaries regarding the Second Amendment. Is self defense even like mentioned in the Constitution? Hold on. Because I know it talks about the right to life, but does it talk about the right to self defense? Gosh, I hate the state of news. Yeah. I mean, according to Cora, self-defense is not specifically set forth in the U.S. Constitution. It depends on the interpretation of the Second Amendment by Heller, which okay, Supreme Court stands up for the right to self-defense. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna go with until I'm proven wrong. I'm gonna go with the self-defense. There's nothing in the Constitution about self-defense. I don't get how you can get self defense out of the Second Amendment, but you can't get abortion out of the right to privacy. They're both just as judicial activists as the other. So yeah. During the 19th century, there was still no need to debate on whether the Second Amendment was an individual right. The right of an individual to bear arms had been so self evident that on the rare occasions it was mentioned to any kind of political or legal context, it was brought up to compare Americans' liberty with tyranny elsewhere. The reason why it probably wasn't necessary was because there probably wasn't as much gun crime back then. As a matter of fact, I could probably make the argument that the right to life that's found in the Constitution, if it was proven that having less guns in the hands of individuals would actually preserve that right to life for more people, then it would probably be unconstitutional to allow individuals to have guns. Which would be a good argument against letting people who are clinically insane have guns. It's probably the argument that people would use to disallow felons to have guns. Um, but that argument could also be used to disallow people who have a history of domestic violence to have guns. Uh, in an 1823 letter, John Adams, William H. Sumner, a politician and a general in the Massachusetts militia, noted that if the population of the United States, like that of Europe, chiefly consisted of an unarmed peasantry, it would be conquerable. Okay, so in a letter to John Adams, he wrote this, and I have no doubt that he believed this, but it wasn't put in the Constitution. Here he went on, every house is a castle, and every man a soldier. Arms are not in every in every hand, confidence in every mind, and courage in every heart. It depends upon its own will, and not upon the force of the enemy, whether such a country shall ever be conquered. Adams concurred with this thinking, and an armed industry would not be susceptible to tyranny. So he should have put it in the Constitution, which the Second Amendment allows for militias. It calls for militias. Like that, but it calls for a well-regulated militia, and even by the definition of regulated in the 17th, 18th century, um, it allows for states to pass gun regulations because they can make the argument that that I want my well function in order for my militia to be well functioning. We've got to have the militia be set up this way, and that way could be a proper proper shoot, what is it called? National Guard. Holy shit. A proper National Guard type deal. If a state wanted to say, "Hey, the National Guard is my militia, and I don't want anyone else having guns because the Constitution calls for a well-regulated militia, and my well-regulated militia in this state is the National Guard." Under the Constitution, the words of the Constitution, that state would have that right to take those guns away if they wanted to. And the only reason they don't is because of Heller, which I'm okay with. I like a elastic boundaries interpretation of the Constitution. I don't like the rigid interpretations that constitutional conservatives try to put out. Um, but it's just so funny to me that when you interpret the Second Amendment by the rigid way that they want to interpret other amendments that gave rights that they don't like, that they have a fit over it. They call it judicial activism. But when you want to interpret the Second Amendment that way because they like the right to have guns, they're okay with it, and it's not judicial activism. It's weird. Contemporary liberals often view this form of anti-government rhetoric and reasoning as best distasteful and at worst an endorsement of treason. Of course, despite our many political battles, there is no need for an armed insurrection today. What contemporary critics fail to comprehend, however, is that the founding generation believed those who would undermine the universal and inalienable liberties of the people laid out in the Constitution, whether they were in the government or not, are the ones committing sedition. The individual rights to bear arms wasn't challenged during the Civil War era, when manufacturing capacity and industrialization of the Union, spurred in part by gun inventors like Sam Colt, not only helped create superior armaments and technology that helped defeat the Confederacy, but also made guns more widespread than ever. During the 1800s, firearms innovation permitted the common man to buy more powerful guns more cheaply. I'm actually curious. I'm actually curious if when was the 1981 one community made an attempt to enact true gun control legislation at the local level. Illinois' village in Morton Grove became the first community in the country to ban the sale and possession of handguns. Okay. During the 1800s, innovation permitted the common man to buy more powerful guns more cheaply. These were the guns Americans used to explore, tame, and ultimately populate the West. This project, with all of its moral implications, both admirable and sometimes ugly, made the United States the most powerful economic power on earth. Never once did any contest anyone contests the right of individual men and plenty of women to own guns. That's fine. There were no laws passed for it back then. Then there was no need to to interpret the Constitution in any way regarding guns. Just because like there were no laws passed for it back then doesn't mean that the Constitution supports the right for individuals to to own guns. It was never contested, so it was never tested. It's true, a number of municipalities in the West enacted the occasional local gun ordinance in their red districts. Gun controllers love to cobble together these rare, narrow, tepid prohibitions to create the impression that there was widespread gun control. You don't even need to do that to make the argument. Not one of these regulations ever challenged the idea of a man's individual rights to own a Remington, Colt, Winchester, or any other gun, or as many guns as he'd like. When weapons were confiscated by authorities, it was typically in an effort to subjugate minorities, mostly blacks, Native Americans, and others who would happen to get in the way of corrupt politicians. You see it a lot now on Twitter. I actually just posted one where people are trying to get trying to ban trans people from having guns. Um, yeah, right here. It's crazy, crazy times we live in. I know you're feeling on it. I think half the people making this argument just pot stirring piss off trans. The guy who also says shit like this, he's very for the Second Amendment. He just wants one party rule. It wasn't until the rise of criminality in the 1930s that there was any federal gun law, and even then, no one made the legal or political argument for the collective theory. It wasn't until the late because nobody had there was no constitutional challenge to it in the 1930s, so you didn't need to make the collective theory. It wasn't until the late 1960s that the left adopted an imaginary understanding of a natural right. Putting all these textual elements together, wrote Justice Antoninus Scalia in his historical philosophy and legal exposition of the Second Amendment, we find that they guarantee the individual rights to possess and carry weapons in case of confrontation. This meaning is strongly confirmed by the historical background of the Second Amendment. We look at this because it has always been widely understood that the Second Amendment, like the First, Fourth Amendments, codified a pre-existing right. The fact that Stevens, messy historically challenged dissent, couldn't persuade Scalia or anyone else is unsurprising. Stevens' feelings about the guns or gun violence do not erase the fact that both in English common law and American life, the individual right to self-defense goes back further than our right to a free press and the freedom of religion. Why didn't they put self-defense in the Constitution then? Yet the fact that Heller, a decision that invalidates a federal law, validate a federal law prohibiting law-abiding citizens from owning handguns in some of the most crime-ridden neighborhoods in America, bothers Stevens more than any other, tells us plenty about his legacy. That was such a bad article. The only thing that he actually quoted that codifies the right of individuals to have guns is the Heller decision. He quote this article quotes one has one quote. Okay. So the article talks about guns history in America, and it talks about one. It has one quote from a somebody who was talking to a founding father. I don't even know if he was a founding father. A politician, General Militia, noted that if a population chiefly consisted of unarmed peasantry, yeah, he's not even. I don't think he didn't even sign the. He didn't even sign the Constitution. He's not a draft. He didn't help draft the Constitution. So the only quote that they have. Fuck, what happened? It's from this guy. And I guess John Adams agreed. is according to the article, which I'm inclined to believe. Um, so I guess yeah. So John Adams believed one thing about the right to bear arms, and um, Alexander Hamilton believed another. Surprise, surprise. The founding fathers disagreed, which is why we can't really use their beliefs to interpret the Constitution all the time because they disagreed a lot, which has been my position from the beginning. The founding fathers disagreed a lot on a lot of things, and if you're going to nitpick certain founding fathers' words in order to make your case, then you're just being a hack. You're not principled in your stance around interpreting the Constitution. And if two founding fathers do disagree, then you should take either or. You should want the interpretation that is going to fit best in society today. Okay. You guys get to see how bad I am at spelling. Basically, it says guns were never challenged in the past. John Adams believe guns were. Oh my gosh, why am I believe? Okay. All right. Do I want to play a video game while I have that on? I don't even know if I have a scene for that. Oh, I do have a scene for that. I don't see the game. Webcam. Okay. Let's play something. Binding of Isaac. Give me a minute. Let me connect my controller. All right. Let me fix this scene real quick. All right. I was here because somebody was telling me something personal. Last time I was, and I forgot to unmute it, so nobody got that on my end, but that's okay. Whatever. Um, Nobody got anything that was said on my end. All right.
Perfect. You got everything I said, right?
They didn't get anything you said
Right.
either.
Right. Oh, so okay. So you're
Both,
just your people are
both.
talking to you on Discord.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nobody's heard anything. It's fine. It's whatever.
We don't. I'm not going to repeat it because my audience heard everything.
So yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine. So basically, what I'm doing is I'm checking. Your, your argument is that this guy that's on food stamps, something had to go wrong in his life in order for him to be on food stamps.
No, no, oh, no, 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 no.
That's
no.
what you said, right? What wrong in your life? Where you made those bad decisions?
I said a lot of people. Now I don't know this person. I didn't talk.
Make videos. So,
saying
and arguments he's making.
A lot of people who are on welfare are okay with the fact that they're on welfare, and they have made bad choices. They either quit high school or they got pregnant, and then they got pregnant and they couldn't get a job, or they got in trouble with the law as teenagers, and instead of turning themselves around and taking advantage of stuff, they just sort of devolved into this thing where they became angry at society or whatever.
Yeah, so your argument is that in general, people on welfare, they made bad choices.
A lot of people on welfare.
A lot of people, yeah.
A lot of people
in general doesn't mean everyone.
There are a lot of people on welfare who legitimately fall on hard times through no fault of their own, and they have kids. Yeah. I think if you are somebody who has a family and you have no income at all in your family through no fault of your own, the government should help you up. They should help you up. They should not do something that instantiates the opportunity for you to become a lifetime dependent person on the federal government.
Okay, so that's something that I want
helping
to
people
look
up,
into.
like was done in 1996 with the contract with America, the welfare reform stuff, that actually said, we will give you these benefits, and if you don't have a job, but you are getting an education where that would make you more valuable to a prospective employer, you can continue to get that. And I think a lot of places will still afford that kind of opportunity, right? But you have to be willing to, have what my grandmother would call gumption. You have to be able to get your shit up off the couch, stop playing video games, and get out and try to do something, anything. Right? We see stories all the time about like people that they're the poor people that are a jam.
Let me get a notepad out. How am I not signed in? Yeah, okay. So his claim is that there are a lot of lifetime recipients of welfare. Okay, that's something we'll look up later.
Janitor for a school, and they don't have a car, and they're walking crazy shit, right, in the snow, whatever, and then somebody sees them, they do a GoFundMe thing, and they raise money for a car for that person, right? That's an example of like community charity, where the people that are able to most likely affect the positive outcome on somebody who is in need, who needs help, are the people that are most local to them. The federal government set up welfare in the 60s as a trap. If they did it, I know in my bones They did it as a mechanism to create a reliable voter base. And that's why every time there's an election cycle that comes around, the Democrats talk about how if you don't vote for us, they're going to cut your welfare. They're going to they're going to end your Social Security. I got news for you. We need to end Social Security. But you can't just rip it out. You got to phase it out with phasing something else in that the government hopefully doesn't control, right? So that people have more independence about what they're going to do. The average return rate for Social Security is 3%, 3.5-ish% or less, right? Over the lifetime of the worker. That's the average, right? That's the average rate of return. The average rate of return in the market is somewhere around 7 to 8% over the long term.
Okay.
Tell me that our politicians couldn't be smart enough to craft a set of rules that would help ensure that you could have these kinds of investments, which would have a very large propensity to deliver more than 3%, right? And you could prevent the risk. You could put guardrails to prevent the riskiness or whatever. But you know why they won't do it? Because it would be giving up so much power. 1/3 of the federal budget is entitlement programs, and that creates a really friggin' reliable voter base.
Okay. So let's say everybody that's on welfare right now, everybody that's working, all the adults that are working flipping burgers, all the adults that are working at Walmart, they do what you say, get a skill, then turn around their lives. What's going to happen to the overall economy?
What do you mean?
What would happen to the overall economy if so this is a question that I really need somebody to contend with. Because I don't know if I'm right on my assessment here. But my opinion is that when conservatives talk about the welfare issue, they have very good advice. They have very good policies for the individual. But their policies are shit when it comes to systems that are supposed to help society. Because if every individual who is on welfare right now, if every individual who's making below a living wage right now were to get a skill and get a higher paying job, they're going to, because by nature of the way the system is set up, end up right back where they were. Because this system needs people to work for low wages. If everybody were to get a skill and get a high paying job, the value of the jobs they are going to get are going to plummet. And yes, the value of the jobs that they were in, that they're leaving, are going to go up. However, because those low paying jobs are going to raise wages, prices of stuff is going to raise, which means that they're going to end up back into the same spot that they were in before. The system is set up to ensure profits and to ensure that wealthy people get a larger portion of the fruits of our productivity. And that needs to change. That is the part that needs to change. Everyone just became skilled workers in order to try to turn around their lives. I should have avoided that. Son of a
one
bitch.
slice out of that equation, right?
What a shitty item.
We talk about
avoid this.
minimum wage jobs used to be jobs in this country when they first came out, or when I was a teenager. Minimum wage jobs were typically low-skilled jobs that people used in order to gain experience, and because people came into jobs, they didn't really know anything. It took longer to train them to do certain types of things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Take the basics of, say, a career, for example, like a Walmart career. You work in Walmart. You may start as a greeter. Of course, now we see a lot of elderly people and people that have disabilities who act as greeters because they want to be able to do something. And God love them, they want to be able to do something. Let them do something, right? And being a greeter really just requires a personality.
I do like that item.
Right? You got to be nice, and nobody's asking you to tackle
However,
a thief.
I don't like it in my first friend spot.
You start out as a
Gemini, isn't it?
entry-level job for Walmart. Maybe you're night stocking, right? And I'll give you a perfect example of this. My sister started out her career at Sam's Club almost 30 years ago, okay, as a night stalker. Not a night stalker, a night stalker. Um, and she did that for about 4 years. And it was back-breaking ass labor. But that's what she did because she had a high school education, okay? And then she moved up to like day stocker, and then she moved into inventory, and then she moved into the cash room because she was a reliable employee who came to work, didn't complain, right? And did good work and cared about what happened with it. So she learned some additional skills along the way, and then she did
Yeah,
more
I didn't do what
advanced
I
things.
wanted
And
to
guess
do.
what? Because she had a better skill set, she was able to move up in the company and make more money in the company, adding more value to the company's
But not everybody that's on the bottom of Walmart can do that. Walmart doesn't need 100 different managers or cash store, which the cash room people don't even make that much money, anyways. But
It's like
like
it's
Walmart
like
doesn't need
she makes
everyone to move up.
no, you're right. They don't need everybody to move up, but you know what? If you can learn skills, if you can learn those skills, you can take those skills or at least a good resume, and you could shop it around to another company.
Maybe I need to make the
Sorry,
point that this is not a good
7 million jobs
system.
currently in this country that are not filled because people
These
won't work,
prescriptions don't
and
make
they're
for a
not
good
all shit
system.
labor jobs, dude.
Okay,
There's
but
jobs out there there's jobs out there people could look at and try to do. Or you can say, these people can't move up because there's not enough billets in the higher skill set. You could always move around.
so what's going I to shouldn't have let him
when
out.
all of
Damn
the
it.
people
Shouldn't have let him out.
who
Oh,
are
he would have let
most that
himself
work
out.
at these low skilled jobs get the skill and they move up? What's going to happen?
I'm sorry. Are you familiar with population growth? There's younger people that come in, right? Entry level jobs typically, historically, okay, were filled by young people as entry level positions where they could get their start doing work. So,
Wow.
yeah, if somebody's working in the stock
1
room
cent
for
for a
2 years
bomb
at
is not
Walmart
bad.
and then they become like maybe a manager, a night manager, a day manager for inventory, that creates an opportunity for some other person to come in and get an entry level job. Why is that a problem for you to see that there is a flow, right? There's a continuum of labor in a large macroeconomic environment.
Because in reality, that's not what's happening. What's happening is that people who need money in order to survive, in order to take care of families, are in these jobs. And you can say, well, they should get better jobs, but they make up a large portion of these jobs. And if they were to leave, these employers will have trouble finding people to replace them. They can go for the high school person, maybe if you find enough of those people to work, but uh, but uh, Shit, I got distracted. But one, a lot of the people that would be leaving is taking a lot of skill that the company actually needs with them. High school people just can't fulfill what an experienced cashier can do. Two, if they can't fill all those positions, which they wouldn't be able to with high schoolers, um, then they're going to have to raise their wages, which is going to make their products go up. It just always runs into the same problems.
Environment.
The thing that you're missing is that right now, that's
The,
not
p-
the way it is. Right now, much
the
of
way
these,
the way
much
it's
of
always
these,
been.
okay, much of these low skilled positions are being filled by people who are adults that probably
Actually, I want
should
to
have
I
had
want to
this
figure
skill
I
by
want to know how
now,
much
but for
what
some
the
Yeah.
stats
reason
on that
they
is.
don't. Like majority, I don't want to say a large portion of these jobs are being filled by people that fit this description. And if they all just up and went and got a skill one day, not only will that dilute the skilled labor market and cause the wages of those things those markets to go down, um, it would also cause the low skilled wages to go up because they have less people to be able to choose from, which will cause what to the prices? The prices will go up. If all that happens, then those people who just got a skill, um, it, that's going into a
I
job
already
market that has
didn't.
lower wages than it used to are going to also be paying more for their shit, which means that they aren't going. Basically, it's going to be a wash. This way the economy is set up, you always have to have a lower class, and the way that things are right now, a lot of that lower class are people that you would say need to get a skill, and if they all got a skill, it did what you said, it would not work for this economy.
Except for the one thing that I think your logic falls down on is that you assume, which is which is diametrically opposed to the
Perfect.
statement you made earlier.
Perfect.
You assume that
Oh,
everybody's
fuck,
going to
another
do
one
it,
too.
and not everybody will do it, right? Because human beings, are lazy people generally. Okay, if
All
the
right, let's
thing
see
is
if there's
hard to
anything
do,
worth it in the store.
chances are there will be fewer people that will attempt it. That's why there are, relatively speaking to the population of the United States, just a few millionaires.
Yeah. So, but the thing is that I
It's
am
not.
trying to come up with a solution that's that's going to work for all these people, and your solution just wouldn't work for all these people.
But you can't, because it is not the responsibility of our government as it's presently constituted to guarantee outcomes, and that's what you want.
No,
But
no. So,
the problem with your logic is you say that, well, I want to raise the floor, okay? But just like the example of giving people $15 an
This is
hour
why
minimum
it's
wage, right?
so frustrating. So frustrating to debate or talk to a constitutional conservative. Because every time you corner them in the practicality argument, they will always default to you can't because it's not in the Constitution. And as we went over earlier, what is and isn't in the Constitution to them is whatever they like. Because you interpret the Second Amendment, which does not mention self defense, as being an amendment for self defense. Well, there's a historical argument for that. And we're going to ignore the historical argument against it and just go with the historical argument for it because I like my guns. But you interpret the welfare clause to mean that the government can provide welfare to people, and that's judicial activism. It's frustrating.
That raised the floor, right? Would you agree? That raised the floor. But then the price of everything that those people did for that $15 an hour magically went up because companies can't work for no profit. There's no reason, there's no incentive to work for no profit, right?
Nobody's
Okay,
asking
might
companies
as well
to
just be
work for
a
no
collective,
profit. As a
a
matter of
government
fact,
collective
I'm
at that point.
against corporate
well,
taxes.
if the
I
if
think
the
that a lot of the
was
taxes
spread out
should come
evenly
from
amongst all of its,
individuals.
population, we would all make around $80,000 a year, which means that the people that are making $20,000 a year, which is a large amount of people, that's going to someone else.
Who's gonna,
We have the resources to do
going
this.
So the point
who's going
of
to innovate?
me
The resource, when
mentioning
you
that our GDP will allow for every person to we have enough we produce enough to give everyone $80,000 a year if we wanted to. Of course, that's going to have negative externalities in that uh, people who have to do jobs that right now they're making over 80,000 a year probably are giving up a large portion of their life that they do not want to give up in order to make that money. And they probably wouldn't do that anymore. So I don't believe that everyone needs to be making $80,000 a year. But what I'm showing is that we have enough resources in this country to take care of everyone. You don't know, nobody needs $80,000 to take care of themselves. Nobody really needs $80,000 as an individual to take care of a family. But we have enough resources for that to happen. That's all I was trying to show. I don't think I purveyed that very well in this debate.
say we have the resources, you mean take somebody else's money and wealth and respread it around.
Yes, to
That's
support.
we have the resources. The people who made the money. No, the people made the money. It's not the government's money. It's not your money. It's not society's money. It's their money.
The people would not be able to make that money without society. So yes, they owe something back to society.
Anyway, back off of the Obama. You didn't build that shit.
Okay.
Okay. Who's gonna?
Wait, do you think those people would be able to make that money by themselves without society?
Who? I don't know. It's called demand, right? It's
Okay.
called demand. When Thomas Edison made the electric light.
Wait,
Okay.
Thomas Edison didn't
You know
make the
what?
electric light. Hold on a second. No, he stole that shit.
Sorry, when he made the first practical incandescent light.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, when he made that, okay, Everybody wanted it. When he developed alternating current as opposed to Tesla's direct current, it was more efficient, and therefore it does. So in the marketplace of ideas, direct current electricity, which was fraught with all kinds of problems, right, and alternating current, which was easier, had less loss, could be done over longer distances. In the marketplace of ideas, one of those guys had a better idea. And everybody went for the better idea. Why? Because people didn't want electric lights that would burn their fucking house down.
I mean, that's great.
But Edison became a millionaire for
Edison didn't do it by himself.
He hired people in his company to do it. The government there was no such thing as a fucking government subsidy in Edison's day.
Okay.
So who did it? Who did it if he came up with a fucking idea?
Well, he didn't.
Right?
He expanded on somebody else's idea.
So what?
And not only that, like everything that Edison learned when it came to electricity came from somebody else. The fact that he was able to learn that came from somebody else's innovation. The fact that he was able to get around, to go to school, to go to work, came from somebody else. Like all that shit came from like most of what went into the light bulb when you actually spread it out to everything that Edison needed to make that happen came from somebody else.
Didn't come from the government.
I don't know what the government was doing and what the government wasn't doing back then, so I can't speak to that. But I can tell you that that Steve Jobs drove on roads that came from the government.
Yeah. So you drive on roads that come from the government.
Yeah.
How much money do you contribute?
Oh, I guess whatever I spend on my gas tax.
What's your tax rate?
My tax
What's your
rate?
rate? Yeah.
I'm a single guy working a government job with no kids. It's actually probably in the 20s, my effective rate, maybe 30s.
Do you own your own house?
No.
Okay. So you pay rent. You have bills. You have a government job. Great. Okay. You're not one of those guys that's drawing welfare. Hopefully the federal government pays you a wage where you don't need welfare.
Well, I work for a state
Why
government.
does he?
Yeah, I
He
don't
always
know
thinks
welfare.
that I'm working for.
Okay. Well,
Like, when I
so
say
what are you
government, I'm
doing-
talking
what are
about
you
the federal
doing to make
I find that
society
kind of odd.
more efficient.
Well, I'm a counselor. I try to help people have fuck up in their lives think about it in different ways so when they get out of prison they don't fuck up.
Okay, so as part of that counseling, do you tell people it's not their fault that really society took a shit on them?
No, there are definitely things that people that are much more understandable considering their circumstances. But I don't tell them it's not their fault.
So what do you mean that they're understandable? Like what? Like give me a for instance. What's understandable?
Well, there was a woman that was in prison because of a money scheme that she did, but it wasn't really a scheme. What she did was she gave a bunch of people who was ripped off by their dentist back their money.
So she embezzled from the
Yeah,
dentist.
she was there for embezzlement, but like the dentist was giving them procedures that they didn't need, and she gave them back. That's like an understandable thing, and she went to prison.
It's not understandable. It's not understandable. Why do you make excuses for that?
Oh my god.
Whether, you know, the fact that she understood that they were ripped off, or that they were getting procedures. Why did she report the dentist to the medical board and then make a public stink about it, where the people could have sued, right?
I think that he thinks that like the system is already set up to be as perfect as possible. Reporting them to the medical board probably wouldn't have done anything. He feels like the system is set up perfectly the way it is, except for all these poor people who are getting help.
People could have sued.
I don't think it's illegal to sell healthcare that you don't need.
I think it is if it's done under false pretenses. Yeah, no, you can make a complaint before the medical board.
Shit, all right, right
But
into
whatever.
that.
But this is an excuse. This is a specific case, right? And we don't ever need to know anybody's names, right? But this is a specific instance where you, a government employee, have decided that embezzlement was okay, because
it's a difference between being okay and being understandable.
But no, when you say it's understandable, you are making a tacit approval of it, because the person did says, look, what you did was wrong, and you need to own up for it, and you need to think about how you think about things, right? Because there was a
So what I would say to that person is that I understand why you did what you did. It probably felt very noble, but there was probably other things in which you could have done that could have helped the people that your dentist was ripping off that wouldn't have landed you in jail. Like that's what I would say.
defect in her logic that made her think that that was an okay thing to do, regardless of her intent. It was an illegal act.
Do you think that everybody that's in prison right now is there because they had some kind of defect in their logic, and they thought the things they did they thought it was okay?
I think most people that are in jail because they did something wrong and they were convicted of a crime. Now, if we want to talk about the relative fairness or the application of like fairness in the judicial system and the way that we prosecute crimes, I think that that is a fair conversation that we can get into and say, are people routinely overcharged in order to get people to plea down to a lesser sentence that is still more than maybe they would have done if they had gone to trial? Do prosecutors and do prosecuting attorneys and DAs, are they overly aggressive about what they do in order to try to further their own ends, meaning political, like seeking political office or whatever? Got to get that murder conviction so I can run for, state's attorney or something. I think there's a fair amount of that. I think there's a lot of corruption at all levels of the government. And I think and that's caused by people who get in and then they get comfortable with what they're doing. And yeah, I do think that leads to negative outcomes that adversely affect some people. Okay, but if you happen to be one of those people who got kind of dicked over by the system, then your thought process is probably not super defective. You just got caught up in a thing, and you could still. There's a lot of people that go to jail and come out of jail, right, or have altercations with the law, and then they come out and they turn their life or their approach to how they look at problem solving into a different direction that actually allows them to be successful. And we see stories about it all the time, but it's not easy, right? And that gets to my original point. Not everybody is going to do the hard work in order to be successful.
Yeah, and if everybody did do the hard work in order to be successful,
I'm
it's going
my
to
controller.
the system needs people to work at the bottom. You say that high schoolers or whatever is going to take those positions.
So, yeah, okay. In your utopic world, in your fantasy land where everybody makes 80 grand and nobody makes any anybody else.
I don't think everybody should make 80 grand. I think there should be a floor, and that floor is not 80 grand. I'm just telling you, we could afford to give everybody 80 grand if we want to spread the wealth evenly.
Okay, so if we let's expound on that, and we can back off of it a little bit, okay? For you to refine this, but at everybody making the same thing, everybody gets the same thing.
Who determines what I want?
It's the same thing. Just a floor. A floor.
What's the floor?
I think that there is a certain amount.
No. A certain amount is ambiguous. What is the floor?
I can't give you a number because that's going to change from place to place.
And how often does the floor have to change?
No, I'm not saying over time. I'm saying that the floor in California is going to be different than the floor in West Virginia. I can't just give you a number, but I can give you like things that I think people should be able to afford.
So if people can have a higher floor in California, what prevents all the people in West Virginia from going to California?
They wouldn't be able to afford as much. They wouldn't be able to afford the same amount of stuff in West Virginia as they would in California.
Assumably, right? Assumably, if they had just enough money to get to California, they could reap the benefits of whatever California is doing.
I don't think you understand.
No, I do understand what
well,
you're saying.
That wasn't
you're
worth
saying
it.
There needs to be a floor, but you won't define the floor.
Yeah, I'm trying to, but you interrupted me and tried to ask for a number. When I told you I can't give you a number. You won't just let me speak and engage with me. Okay,
well,
I think the floor should be whatever it takes
Yep, I died.
to be able to afford certain things. Shelter, utilities, stuff like that. So that's going to be different in West Virginia. What it takes to afford those things is going to be different in West Virginia than it is going to be in California. That's why I can't give you a number.
Okay, so assume, for argument's sake, you're able to define this number. This ethereal number that varies state to state based on the actual cost of expenses in each particular state.
Damn,
Assuming
I lost the fucking
happens,
magic mush run.
What's the incentive? If everybody can get what they need as a guarantee, what's the incentive for anybody to do anything above and beyond the minimum?
Because people do above and beyond the minimum, regardless of the fact that they already have what they need already. Like, I have everything I need and more. I go above and beyond the minimum so that I can have that, so that I can give that to little people in my life. So, like, there's definitely incentive there still. You don't need to starve people to death and make them homeless in order to incentivize them to.
No, but nobody said. See, I think you're looking at this in a convex way or a concave way. You're saying that if we don't give them these things, it is akin to the government starving people to death.
The government's definitely allowing people to starve to death.
What would happen to the person that's on drugs, does not want to work in a system like yours?
Why the person on drugs?
I don't know. So I know. Actually, no. I can give you an answer to this. I can give you an answer to this because I ask inmates all the time why they're on drugs. Most of the time, it's because their parents gave them drugs when they were very young. They grew up watching their parents being strung out, and they were given drugs by their parents. One lady was actually sold by her parents to another members of their gang. This happens a lot in the the Hells Angels and white gangs, where they're selling their children, daughters mostly. And she was given drugs, being strung out by those people. So yeah, shit like that is why these people.
Sure. Okay, you brought up a couple points, and I want to throw a term out there for you and see if you understand what it is. Do you understand what generational poverty is? Yeah. You know what generational welfare is?
I would imagine it's the phenomenon in which generational poverty turns into getting welfare over generational poverty.
Right. The corollary to that is exactly what you just described, which is a person gets in trouble because their parents were shit role models. And maybe those parents, and I think you can take this back nearly 4 generations now. That's how bad it is, right? When we from 1946, just after World War II until 1970, income inequality did exist, but it was relatively constant. Meaning, as the economy did better, all racial groups tended to improve at roughly the same rate.
Why is he talking about racial groups? I mean, I understand that race has
and after they had an opportunity to sort of bake into the economy with the process and the departments and everything got all set up, once they began instantiating massive government welfare programs, which is what the Great Society was, you began to see a divergence in economic income, and it was because more people were added to added to welfare rolls at lower income strata. And because so many people were packed into the inner cities, when economic downturns hit the inner cities, you had this massive amount of people that would get on welfare. And welfare was never designed or intended, okay, to be a lifetime commitment.
Wow, I'm really
it never was,
fucking
but people
up
just
on
sort of got used to it. And then you find that once you get into that sort of thing, It's not enough to live on. It's barely enough to survive. Okay, so people would do illegal activities like sell drugs, prostitution. Okay, in order to supplement their incomes. And then you had all kinds of associated violence, right? That goes in with the sex trade, pimps, et cetera, that were just beating the shit out of people
Ooh, they
and keeping them strung out to
do
keep them
one?
compliant. So yeah, there is a lot to what you say that people get jammed into this sort of a condition, okay? But and it may not be the specific individual's fault, although there's still a cost associated with being a problem, a burden to society. It's right to go back and say, well, the parents were fucked up, or nobody ever criticizes, right, the
Bitch.
government policies that created the maelstrom that made all of these things possible, right? You didn't have these kinds of problems before 1965.
So you don't think that? Hold on. When was prohibition?
In the 20s.
In the 20s. So we had people selling illegal drugs before 1965.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how are you blaming welfare for that?
We're talking about scale, dude. You had people selling illegal booze, and people's heroin was a kind of a big thing, right? It wasn't illegal per se back then. It wasn't until
Oh my
the 50s
goodness.
that heroin was made illegal. But the problem you're trying to take this thing off to the side rail. What I'm trying to tell you is that when you put people into a situation where they have either no skill set or they were in jail and they come out and they end up being a welfare recipient because of X, then they get into that space and it's free money to them. And if it's not enough, then what they do is they resort to other things. And there is.
So give them more.
You
Holy
were-
crap. So give them enough. Give them enough. Oh my gosh. He just made the argument for expanding welfare.
It appears that you work with people who have been incarcerated. You obviously have access to statistics.
I
Right?
don't.
You have access to the material that allows you to understand that, yes, there is a strong correlation, if not causation, of what happened in the Great Society to what has happened in particularly inner cities. And inner cities, I'm sorry, man, they're heavily skewed toward either immigrant populations or lower income African Americans.
So
Right.
if somebody gets out of prison and they're not on welfare, what are they going to do?
They're going to get a job. They're going
You think they're going to get a job instead of just selling drugs like they would anyways?
Well, isn't that a choice at that point? Like, you get caught. You
You
get
have
caught.
a choice on or off welfare. The welfare makes it easier to make the other choice.
Yeah, it makes it easier to make the choice because you can get
So
something for free that carries your bills.
basically, what he's trying to do here is he's trying to blame welfare for things that would have happened anyways. So he's trying to say that because of welfare, welfare isn't enough. So people are selling drugs, and blaming welfare for that, for like the selling drugs part. But if you didn't have the welfare, you would still sell drugs. Like they would still sell drugs. Not only that. Not only that, welfare probably stops more people from selling drugs because for some people it is enough.
While you're trying to set up your drug lab.
We live in two. Let's pretend we live in two. There's two different worlds we're looking at. We have one world where there's no welfare and somebody gets out of prison, and we have another world where there is welfare and somebody gets out of prison. You're telling me that in the world where there is no welfare, that person's not going to choose to sell drugs, whereas the person that is on welfare is going to choose to sell drugs?
What did they do before? What did they do before 1960?
A lot of them probably sold drugs.
Okay, so you say this, right? You say it as though it's a truism, but you don't have
Before
the evidence.
1960, we could have had people. I don't know. They could have been having people dying on the streets for all I know.
We didn't have a massive drug problem in this country, okay, before the 70s.
Yeah, there's probably a lack of ability or for average person to produce drugs before the 70s. But we had the ability for average people to produce alcohol before the 70s, and when that went on prohibition, we saw a massive problem with that.
Sure we did. Yeah, the speakeasy and everything else. Sure. Yeah, people decided to do their own thing, and some people got busted for it. Some people went to jail. Right, and some people, when they came out, they decided they were just going to keep doing it. A lot of moonshiners in the hill country, right? Yeah, like your part of the world. I grew up in Virginia. Franklin County was just one county south of where I grew up. This moonshine is like the moonshine capital of Virginia, and people would just make illegal stills because they didn't want to pay the man tax revenue, right? That's was the thing, and they were okay with living with the consequences. And they'd get out and they would just go make some more stuff. They made a bad choice. They got caught, and they kept making the bad choice because it was something they knew how to do, and it was too hard to go work for somebody for no money. They made more money doing the illegal activity than they did getting whatever the welfare might have been or whatever.
That's you're talking about issues with the system. Yes, people who are working for other people aren't making enough money, so they end up doing illegal things. The solution to that is to have a floor at which every working person it will not fall below. And the way to do that, one way to do that, could be through government programs that redistribute wealth, because the people who are working full time are creating massive wealth, and oftentimes for people who own the capital in which they use to work. And we don't need that. We don't need the massive wealth up top. People will still do it for a decent amount of wealth. people would still be CEOs for $100 million a year instead of $1 billion a year.
Real job might have paid them based on their skill set, right? The point I'm making here is that the fact that people, when they were in jail before the Great Society, they came out and they knew they had to live. There was no floor for them, right? And they went out and they found some kind of a job, even if it was sweeping the street. And you think it's like, well, the homelessness, right? We have more homeless people today than at any time in the history of this country, including before the Great Society law was passed. People choose.
I wonder if that's
to
true
do
per
the wrong
capita.
thing. Voluntarily choose to do the wrong thing. People say, well, we'll give you're homeless. We'll give you help. You need drug treatment. You need this and that. And they go, no. I just want the money. I want to be free to do what I want with my own body. And you can't force them. You can't force them not to. But why should society pay for them? Why should we?
The other option is die.
Because it's the human thing. But if you want to kill yourself with drugs, kill yourself with drugs.
Okay, so that's fine. If your position is that I do not care if homeless people die, then that's fine. But let's not pretend that your solution is going to be better for them.
My solution is to say that we have a constitution, and that constitution provides framework,
Fuck
bedrock law.
me.
And
Die.
everything
Just kill
that we
me.
do
Just
in
kill
this
me.
country has to have a legal component. That's why we don't. That's why we didn't instantiate a king. If you don't like the way the law is, meaning the thing that affords all of the other law its standing, every legal thing that's done by the federal government or state government has to comport with the U.S. Constitution.
Which
If
would
you-
allow homeless
There he
people to die.
goes. There he goes again.
Uh,
I get him to admit that his solution, his systemic solution, will lead to people dying. Like that's essentially what he's saying here. And now he's going back to the Constitution.
You can change the Constitution. No, because I think the vast majority of people in this country don't want a socialized system.
Okay, so homeless people die.
Homeless people die because of their own choice.
Okay, but like the system isn't going to save them, so they just die, right? You're okay with that?
There's nothing that says that a state like California, okay, can go ahead and just voluntarily say that they want to raise their taxes to the point where they can have enough revenue to take care of their homeless population.
Okay, so I want to make this argument from your world right now. What happens when a state raises taxes?
State raises taxes because the people that
What happens when that happens? What happens to what do the wealthy people in that state do when they raise taxes?
you mean they go to Texas or Florida?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's kind of impossible unless we do it on a federal level.
But you can't.
Okay, so homeless people die under your system.
No.
Yeah, you just let them die because the state can't do it by themselves.
Why can't they?
Because if they raise taxes, all the people that would be paying taxes leave.
Okay, so your idea is that you have to raise everybody's taxes everywhere in a uniform way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, not
Yes.
You have to raise taxes on
Because,
wealthy more because
I mean, that's a Republican talking point. That if somebody raises taxes, rich people leave that area. They argue against it for raising the taxes in the country. They argue against it for raising taxes in the states. They argue against it for raising taxes in the city. And the smaller the government that's raising the taxes, the more true that becomes. It's much easier to up and leave a state because they have too high of taxes than it is to leave a country. Of course, every wealthy person can do that, but a lot of wealthy people have ties in America that they don't want to leave. Some wealthy people have ties in states that they don't want to leave. Very few wealthy people are going to have ties in a city that they don't want to leave. So it becomes the bigger the government, the harder it is for capital flight to happen in. So if the country were to raise taxes in order to provide for the welfare of its people, then you're going to have a lot less of that phenomenon in which wealthy people are leaving that country. And not only that, where the fuck are they going to go? How many tax havens are there in this world that's a first world country? A lot of European countries and a lot of Asian countries are taxing their people higher than we are anyways.
poor people can't afford to take care of other people, let alone themselves.
You know what the 14th Amendment
Flip
guarantees?
that.
Among the things, do you know what the 14th Amendment of the Constitution does?
So the equal protection clause, and you're going to argue that I already know your argument because we went over this on Twitter. You're going to argue that taxing wealthy people more is against the equal protection clause, but I'm going to argue that wealthy people don't need protection from taxes. Taxes aren't like a thing that people need protecting from. It's a thing that people pay into for society.
Treating one group of people differently than another group is a violation of the 14th Amendment.
Well, then capitalism is a violation of the 14th Amendment.
No, it's not, because the government, to the extent that the government allows trade and truck and barter and trade, which is actually part of the Constitution, right? Because to promote the general welfare and to make post roads was designed explicitly to facilitate trade among the several states. So the capitalist system is baked into our Constitution.
I mean, I agree with that. The capitalism is baked into our Constitution, but if you're going to expand
fuck,
the
I've
14th
already
Amendment
found that.
the way that you are,
Damn
I'm
it, I
going to
just
argue
wasted
that
that bomb.
rich people shouldn't be able to buy private lawyers because I'm not getting equal protection as somebody that would defend on a public defender from the law. Like, I'm not getting equal protection. That's for damn sure.
if you're basically saying that I can't work hard, develop some wealth, and if I get into a situation, whether it's civil or criminal, that I can't use the money I earned, that I legally earned, that I can't use that money to afford myself the best representation I can afford. You're
Well,
saying that
I don't think that everybody in America can afford Donald Trump's representation.
yeah, it's true.
So that's not, and it's possible under our system for everybody to afford Donald Trump.
Here's what I'm about. I don't want to sidetrack this because I've already told you that yes, there is room to take a look at how we mete out justice, okay, and how we apply the law to people. And you could
one hell of a dodge.
possibly be able to get me to believe that there should be a uniform bar, that there should be no private lawyers. But then you'd be telling lawyers they can't practice law, well, unless you're doing it at a flat rate. And again, what's going to happen there is that people are just not going to study.
So
hard.
he's
They're not
making the
if there's no-
practicality
if there's no-
argument. So any other time it would be a constitutional argument, but now he's making a practicality argument. He's absolutely right. If we applied the 14th Amendment in that way, then we would be telling government lawyers that they can't practice private law. That is true, and that's probably going to be bad for the justice system overall. Because if you make everyone a public defendant, then we're not going to have as many lawyers in this country. While it's shitty that a wealthy person can hire representation for themselves and get better representation than I do, it would be even shittier if the limited amount of public defenders that we had also had to go to wealthy people. So them being able to hire their own lawyers does take away from the stress of the system that is in place for poor people.
Oh, no benefit
But like that's not a constitutional argument. That's a practicality argument.
of working hard. People will choose to not work hard, right?
Yeah,
Oh,
so-
yeah, but I was saying-
what you're arguing is against the Constitution, though. What you're arguing right now is what I argue for things,
no.
because practically speaking,
you argue that that is a 14th Amendment violation. I don't think anybody rationally would believe that nor try to defend it. It is
But
an emotional
not-
argument. that you
nobody
are making.
rationally would say that taxing wealthy people higher is a 14th Amendment violation.
I think that anybody rationally would believe that taxing wealthy people is a violation of a 14th Amendment.
Oh, I
do.
said
I'm not
that.
wealthy, I think it's bullshit. I
Okay,
think
I mean, that's fine.
see this,
But I
right?
think by that logic,
Let me dovetail into something you said when you said that it costs more money to live in the rate that you would get in California would be more than it would be in West Virginia because there's a cost differential associated with living, right? We agree on that. We know that different parts of the country cost more or less relative to the others. Here is my thought process.
Nice.
If you excluded from taxes, any tax, food, clothing, shelter, transportation to work, and healthcare, if you made all of those things tax-free up to a nationally adjusted amount, right? So you can say that nobody's getting a preferential deal over anybody else's. And all the poor state people would benefit from the rich state people like California, right? Because that rate would be higher because of that. If everybody had all of that money, that income, tax-free, but then had to pay a same tax rate for every other dollar that they make, would that be fair? Would that be reasonable to you?
The problem with that is that you wouldn't have any money in the government for the government to be able to do the things that it needs to do.
so okay,
So
I'm
you're
assuming.
still paying much more money because even at the same percentage, right?
Ask me a question,
We're still
you kept
gonna pay
talking.
more money.
Ask me a question. You kept talking. Oh, okay. So I'm assuming that if I were to come up with other things that are a necessity of living in this
Damn
society,
it all.
then
And I
you
forgot to
probably
get the
would
black.
be right?
Goodness.
It's not just those like 5 categories that you listed, right?
I think if the basic necessities of civil society, right? Now the person still has to pay for their health care, the person or get their own insurance, right? But then it would be tax-free to them.
Do you
Right.
think that like the burden of healthcare insurance for poor people? Do you think the most of the burden is from the taxes in healthcare or the premiums and co-pays and
Premium.
deductibles?
Premiums, pay co-pays, deductibles.
Okay, so
Sure.
how's that help the poor person?
Well, I think that insurance is controlled at the state level, right? So state boards of health, state insurance boards can figure out what they want to do. That's why insurance is why there's a Blue Cross of Minnesota, Blue Cross of California, right? Because they're not allowed under federal law. They're not allowed to cross state boundaries. So there are 50 Blue Cross Blue Shields.
So the problem with your system,
Which is
even if
ridiculous. It's a ridiculous system.
every single necessity that a poor to lower middle class person would need and make that tax free, well then like most poor people aren't going to pay taxes just like they aren't now. Middle class people will pay a little bit of taxes just like they are now. But then like wealthy people are going to pay a significantly amount less taxes, and the government is just not going to raise enough revenue to do what the government do.
Well, what if the government just did what the government was enumerated to do?
Then poor people die.
Okay, so the only solution to the problem is that the government must, in fact, do explicitly unconstitutional things, or poor people will die.
I mean, isn't that the thing that you conceded earlier?
Just say yes or no. No, I didn't concede jack shit.
Well, so the constitutionality of something.
Your character is like, no, look, if you cannot argue, if you cannot at least appreciate the fact that what you want to do is not currently constitutional, then you are just blowing smoke.
Okay, but like the constitutionality of something is largely controlled by right now the way the system is set up right now, the courts. So and their interpretation of the Constitution. So like I can make the argument, well, the courts have upheld the progressive tax system, and the courts have upheld welfare, and just be like, oh, that therefore it's constitutional.
They say it's constitutional, but that's not the same thing with the Constitutional Amendment.
Damn,
Dred
what
Scott was
was
a
that?
constitutional decision.
Oh my goodness, what was that?
Most people would argue that, I think the vast majority of people would argue that Dred Scott was a problem.
Yeah.
Right? Plessy versus Ferguson was a bad problem, was it not? Okay. So the fact that laws
Fuck this.
are
Fuck
passed,
me.
or
Fuck
that
everything.
cases may be incorrectly decided
I'm
by
done.
9
I
human
don't
beings,
want to play
9
Isaac
or whatever the
anymore.
number happens to
No,
be.
I
It's been
do.
as high as
But
13,
I
it's been as
don't
low as
want to
9,
play this
or
character.
as
I
8.
want to play Eden.
6,
I want
I'm
to
sorry.
stop being bad at this game.
The fact that justices are human beings and may fallibly fuck up the interpretation of what the Constitution is not the same thing as somebody getting together, the House and the Senate, in a 2/3 vote, passing a bill by 2/3, and the president signing it into effect, and then that gets released to the states, where 3/4 of the states say the sky is purple, and now constitutionally the sky is purple, even though we all look up and we know it's blue, but we've legally enabled ourselves to define the sky as purple by constitutional amendment. That's how you get the thing done. When you say that we can't do these things because the courts say what the Constitution is, the courts infer what they think the Constitution's meaning is based on either their judicial philosophy or their political ideology. Most people on the left could give a shit about the Constitution.
And the right, and the right.
They wanted, Roe v.
They don't
Wade.
give a shit that the Second Amendment doesn't.
Because it
Oh, I
made
shouldn't have
the
got
politicians
this.
didn't have to take the hard stand.
I
They
thought
had
these
for
were
50
X-ray
years,
glasses.
and there have been significant majorities of Democrats over the course of history. Since 1973, they could have passed or made an attempt to pass a federal protection for abortion. They could have passed a constitution. Well, it would never do a constitutional amendment, but they could have tried to pass a federal law. They didn't do it. You know why? Because they could argue that the Supreme Court is the law of the land. And I would argue to you that the Supreme Court is not the law of the land. If they were the law of the land, they would never make a mistake.
They're interpreting the law of the land.
That's right, but the Congress and the White House, can alter that. Okay?
Yes, they can.
The reason why there's 3 branches, and they all were intended to pull at each other, right? So that you required 2 houses to do a thing. So if the House and the Senate and the White House, the Congress and the White House decided that something that was done by the Supreme Court was fucked up, it may be quote unquote constitutional, they could pass an amendment and they could correct it. The other thing that they could do, is that they can actually limit the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. That's within the Constitution. They can limit the jurisdiction, what the Constitution or what the court can do. So the concept of like flag burning, for example. The Supreme Court held that flag burning was constitutionally protected free speech. The Congress, without having to enact a constitutional amendment, could have limited, the Supreme Court's ability to decide free speech on that particular ground. They could have done it. They didn't.
No!
Right? Because the people that wanted to bitch about it were all leftists, and that's good, right? Because they had an activist court.
Damn it all.
So the fact
I could have used
Wait,
that.
you think that the flag burning decision was an activist judge making that decision?
Do you know when it was?
No,
You know who?
but
you know-
it seems pretty obvious that freedom of
No, no.
expression is a part of freedom of speech, and flag burning is that.
What I'm telling you is that was done during a very liberal time period of the court.
So any liberal decision, any time that a court makes a decision and it was a liberal time, it was just activist judges.
Oh, wait a second. So, would you make that argument? Would you say that the Casey decision was done by an activist court?
Is that that's the abortion one, right?
Yeah, would you say the Dobbs decision was done by an activist court?
I would have to look at the decisions more in order for me to do.
Okay.
Say
But
that.
you don't think that the creating of a substantive right of privacy, medical privacy, was done out of a 14th Amendment bastardization, right?
Yep. And the Second Amendment, Heller created the right to own guns for self-defense. That is not in the Constitution.
Even Ruth Bader Ginsburg said the legal reasoning for Roe and Casey was fucking retarded.
Didn't she say that there was just a better argument in the Constitution than the 14th Amendment?
But that argument wasn't made.
Yeah, but like she said, she said that there was a better argument.
She said it was improperly
She
decided.
didn't say it was.
And whether she wanted to say that there was stronger legal grounds for some other thing like illegal search and seizure, right, 5th Amendment or whatever, or 4th, 5th, or 6th Amendment, maybe, right, you could have done that, but that's not the argument that people hung their hat on, and that's not what the court found, right? Just like Plessy was just fucked up, and Dred was fucked up, Roe was fucked up. Casey all but gutted Roe. Like, there was everything up until the 3rd trimester under Roe. Casey essentially gutted that decision. It still left abortion intact, but it allowed states to put quote unquote reasonable restrictions. okay, which was really a significant dilution of what Casey had found, not Casey, but what Roe had found. And then Dobbs said, you know what? The 14th Amendment, there was no abortion. People bitched it like Clarence Thomas, right? Because he used 1849. He went back to 1849 for his law reasoning. That's how they do it, right? If there's no precedent, there was no abortion that was legal in the United States when the 14th Amendment was made. Nobody had even thought of it. So how can anybody say that there was intentionality by the people who either debated the 14th Amendment or those who ratified it, that they thought about abortion as being a substantive right? If they had thought, and the founders and the people that wrote these earlier amendments, they were explicit in the wording that they used. The words had meaning and purpose. And that's why, I mean, I argue as a constitutionalist that when the Constitution says provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare, those are two different words, and they mean two different things. They mean two different things today. They explicitly meant two different things in 1789. Okay, there's a difference in doing things or creating policies that promote the general welfare without providing the general welfare. People on the left want to say that the Constitution says promote the general welfare, and that's what we do. And then virtually every fucked up thing that the federal government does is done under a bastardized reading of the Commerce Clause.
Wait, hold on. So what does general welfare mean? What does that mean or do to the Constitution?
To facilitate trade among the several states, right? To facilitate trade that would allow people to be able to work in relative freedom and be able to take their God-given rights and be able to do what they were.
You could argue welfare helps facilitate trade because people who don't have money cannot participate in trade.
What they could do without the government laying down on top of them and telling them, no, you can't.
What are you basing that off?
What do you mean? What about look at the Federalist Papers.
Ah, fuck me. I'm done. Ah,
Nothing,
damn it all.
You will not find a single modern definition, okay, of the Commerce Clause that doesn't mean pay for welfare that doesn't come from a leftist publication or a leftist act. Period. You can contort, right? Just like Casey contorted the right to privacy. Not Casey, but Roe contorted the right to privacy. Okay, all of the welfare, all the other shit that the federal government has foisted on the American people since 1914 has been predicated on some bastardized liberal progressive meaning of what it is to promote the general welfare. And I'm sorry to break it to you, it's just not constitutional. The fact that I can't speak to a constitutional case where some justice has said it's done is irrelevant, because it is in that point. People couldn't argue against Dred Scott because that was the interpreted law of the land until the Civil War, until the 13th and 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment.
Does the let me ask you something. Does the federal?
That was an example where the federal
Why can I not
got it wrong.
Is it because of this?
Okay, and a Civil War happened, and then constitutional amendments came out that reversed the practical effect, made moot Dred.
Does the Federalist Papers say anything about what the Second Amendment is supposed to mean?
Yeah,
which one?
There were competing theories. I can't give you the explicit one off the top of my head. It's been a while since I've read it. And it's a hard read because of the way that the language operated.
Yeah.
But there was intentionality, right? Mostly because the dispute between Hamilton and John Jay, okay, where everybody thought, and practically every citizen owned a firearm, okay, at the founding of the country, because most of them were militia, most of them were part of the militia, or they hunted for subsistence, right? So the militia, where the Second Amendment says that a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. I think I may have fucked it up, but essentially that's what it is. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, right? They're semicolon joined. There are two separate things, and people today, in modern language sense, they say, "Oh, well-regulated." We talk about gun laws,
I know that argument. You say that it's well-trained, right?
It means well-trained or state-trained, meaning the states, because there was no provision in the Constitution for a standing army, right? Despite Hamilton's stringent, ardent plea for, right? Constitutionally, there's a Navy. There was no constitutional army, right?
So we get rid of the army?
No. There's a Department of Defense. The Department of Defense is what it does now. And I'm not arguing.
Wait, hold on. Where's that in the Constitution?
Wait, what is the constitutional argument for the Army? What is the constitutional argument for the military? Is that in the Constitution? I don't know, because I'm not a constitutional conservative. I don't spend my life trying to interpret the Constitution in a way that's going to benefit my particular political beliefs. But, there's no consistency here.
Okay.
The fact that it's not, I mean, the Navy is explicitly called for, right? Just like the coining of money using gold and silver is called for. There's nothing in the Constitution that says we should ever have fiat currency. But the practical effect is that as long as the debts of the United States are sovereign and agreed to be paid, it doesn't matter the form that it takes. theoretically. Anyway, but the idea that the states, right, because it was a republic of states, that the states were responsible for training their militias because the militias would be called upon by Congress. That's why the executive, or well, by the executive, and authorized by Congress, right? For the president declaration of war, the president says, okay, Tennessee, send me your people, right? And then Tennessee says, okay, we agree to send you our people, right? That's how the militia works. And then the states were responsible for making sure that everybody would train. There was actually provisions in state law, most state law, that you had to have a certain amount of lead shot, you had to have a certain amount of powder, you had to have a weapon, right? They actually
warfare was to
edicted
keep
in the
Congress
law
warm.
of the state that you had to own a firearm.
Uh,
So if that was the intention, what makes you think that anybody can reasonably agree, okay, or that anybody can reasonably infer that they never intended for individuals to own guns?
So
Because volunteer.
wouldn't it be based off of the words of the Constitution?
I don't understand this argument. We get corruption because of welfare.
That you have to have a certain amount of training with this weapon, with a gun, in order to have that gun, and even like maintain.
So basically, anybody who's going to try and argue that welfare leads to corruption is basically arguing that the government doing things for the people is corruption, and that's just not the case. The government doing things for the people is what the government is supposed to do. They're supposed to do the things that we vote them in for. If the government wants to help homeless people, then that is what I'm voting people, the people into the government to do.
In that training, would that be constitutional?
No.
Why?
Because if you prevent somebody from keeping and bearing arms, that's an infringement.
Yeah, but it says that they do not want that to be infringed for the purpose of a well-regulated or well-trained.
Two separate statements. There are two separate statements. You're
in the same
complaining.
sentence?
It's not the same sentence. Look at the grammar.
It is the same sentence. It is the same sentence.
It's just commas all the way through, isn't it? Yeah, a well-regulated and necessary security of the state. Yeah, it's one sentence.
Okay.
So
Okay.
a well-regulated.
So you were just wrong about that.
Militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So the purpose of the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed is to have a well-regulated militia or well-trained militia.
What is the people?
The people of the militia.
How do you know that? I mean,
it's in the words of the Constitution. And as a matter of fact, the Federalist Papers number 29 says that the militia isn't everybody.
That's right. It was the people who were in the militia. But the people, right? When we say we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, we the people is everybody.
Yeah, because there's no qualifier at the beginning of that statement. There's a qualifier in the Second Amendment.
No, that's not a qualification. It's a comma is an add-on descriptor. It is not. It is a militia. Well, the militia was made up of the people. Okay,
but it wasn't everybody.
You cannot. It doesn't matter.
Okay, so that means that everybody shouldn't be allowed to have arms, just the people of the militia. And what the militia is defined in Federalist Papers number 29. Until we pass the Militia Act, which I could argue is unconstitutional because it could be argued that the Militia Act does not facilitate a well-regulated militia.
Okay, A, stretch. B, the fact that a Militia Act is a method of codifying training, or codifying the formal existence of something that eventually becomes the National Guard, okay, I think is irrelevant to the original point, right? Everybody.
I'm not saying. Wait, hold on. I'm not saying the National Guard has to be the only definition of a militia. I'm saying that the Second Amendment leaves room for states to have a training requirement before they're allowed to bear arms.
Is training a good idea? Should it be encouraged?
That's
Sure.
not what I'm saying.
I'm saying that the Constitution allows room for states to require that for people to bear arms.
It doesn't.
Yes, it does. Because why would they put a well-regulated militia being necessary to security of the state if that's not the reason why they want people to keep and bear arms?
A militia that is trained and drilled in the art of war, okay, is necessary for the security of a free state. You can't just have a bunch of random people running around, okay, in a disorganized manner and expect to be able to defend your country.
Yes, that's why not every individual is allowed to have arms under the Constitution. It's just not protected. You just made the argument for me.
Against invaders. Remember, we were talking about people that were invading us, okay, on our own shores, the British, and 50 years earlier, the French, okay. So the fact that they wanted to ensure, or they wanted to specify that a well-regulated militia was necessary to ensure the freedom, right, the free state, it was necessary for people to be able to keep and bear arms. It didn't say everybody. I mean, some state laws required all able-bodied men.
Yeah,
free men had to, do whatever, right?
It doesn't say everybody. You're right.
Have a weapon and and then had to practice with a certain amount of frequency. It's in some state constitutions.
So you should have to.
But they were regulating that you had to train.
Yeah.
As part of your militia duty. That was part of the militia requirement.
Okay.
It wasn't part of the requirement to own the weapon, right? It's a kind of you're making a semantic leap.
So no, while it's not a part of the requirement under the Constitution to own a weapon, in order for your right to own a weapon to be protected, you have to be a part of the militia. That means that a state should be able to pass laws that stops people from owning weapons. Like it's constitutionally permissible unless they are a part of the militia.
To be able to say that, okay, if for the people that were in states where they were required to drill, okay, and they were required to have a certain amount of ammunition, they were required to have a certain amount of powder and flint.
Every able-bodied person was required to do all this and train.
Yeah, as part of the militia, not as a condition for owning a firearm.
So
you see the difference, right? You see the nuance in what you're doing.
but if that state were to be like, and in order to own this firearm, you need to train for the militia. The Constitution, I don't see how you can look at the words of the Second Amendment and not see where I'm getting that.
Well, I mean, I can look at it. I can look at it that way because I served in the military, and the federal government, through the judiciary, has said the same thing.
Yeah, but I can make that argument for Roe. I can say the federal government through the judiciary said that the 14th Amendment means that abortion is legal.
But you can't. You can't make that
Not
argument
anymore. Not anymore because the judiciary changed it.
That's right. They corrected an incorrect ruling.
So
What are you using to base that on? Like your argument for the Second Amendment is the judiciary. But I can argue that that's an incorrect interpretation of the Second Amendment.
Supreme Court were to reverse Heller. Is it Heller that made the Second Amendment mean self-defense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if a liberal Supreme Court were to reverse Heller, would you call that a activist Supreme Court?
Yeah.
Okay, even though when you look at the words of this Constitution, it seems like it is very reasonable to conclude that the military is the reason why the right to bear arms of the people shall not be infringed. The militia, I'm sorry, not the military, the militia, and that militia needs to be well regulated, which means well trained, which means that it's reasonable to allow states to require a training requirement before their people can bear arms.
You don't think that there's a I disagree with your assertion, but you don't think that there's a better way to do that, like encourage, maybe give somebody a tax break for ensuring that they're compliant. When I was in high school, everybody took hunter safety. It was actually part of the educational curriculum.
Wait, so the point of this isn't for me to try to get more people trained on weapons. The point of this is for me to demonstrate.
You would prefer that weapons not be part of society.
No. The point of this is for me to demonstrate that by your philosophy around the Constitution, Heller was a activist ruling.
Heller found that a person has our fundamental rights, right? Remember, our rights don't come to us from the government. Our rights come to us from God.
Oh, no! What? No! No! This is America. We're a secular country.
We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights.
They didn't say God.
Wait, hold on. Is that in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence? It's in the fucking Declaration of Independence. It's not in the Constitution. Oh my gosh. Wow. I really wish I'd caught that. I really wish I'd caught that. Oh.
They didn't say a Christian God. Oh my gosh.
Well,
Oh gosh.
Okay, again,
Oh
semantics,
man,
right?
I'm having an
Endowed by our
aneurysm. I've got to be
Creator
having an
with certain
aneurysm.
unalienable rights. Among those, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Is that in the Constitution? I'm pretty sure I looked that up. Yeah, I think they changed the property in the Constitution. That's the Declaration of Independence. It's not even in the Constitution. Is it in the Constitution? No state shall make and enforce law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of a citizen of the United States, nor shall a state deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person. So no. It's saying the state can't deprive people of life, liberty, or law. Okay. But they're not calling it like a fundamental right. Anyways.
If you are living in Dodge City and you don't have a gun, you are at risk of losing your life, right? In the 1880s.
Okay, so if you are homeless on the street starving and you don't have food, you're at risk of losing your life. Therefore, the government should provide food.
No, God.
Okay. What?
No, because your argument, there's a difference between the government empowering the government the government is created by men for the protection of those rights. Okay? The right of individuals to do things. We live in a society of individual freedom. The 9th and 10th Amendment guarantee us a Republican form of government and a right to dictate how that government runs. And we agreed as 13 original states, we agreed, and has subsequently been upheld and ratified and amended a number of times, we agreed that it would take a vast majority of the states in this country, okay, to make a change to that document because the founders wanted something that would be long lived, because stability was key and crucial for this American experiment to continue forward. When you and the leftists that exist today, progressives, right, really since Woodrow Wilson, when those guys came in and said, well, we need to do these other things because we want to do X, Y, or Z. Okay, and we think the government should do it. So we're just going to, by fiat operation of federal law, we're going to just make these things happen. Okay, and the vast majority of what these people did was unconstitutional, but it got through and it developed precedent because people sat on their ass and people didn't rise up and say, you know what, that's kind of fucked up. That's really messed up. This is one of the reasons why the Second Amendment is so vociferously defended in this country, because it was put into place to prevent tyranny of the government. Okay,
Okay, so what's it put into place for self-defense? Personal self-defense.
No, that's the right to life.
The right to life.
Okay, the ability to defend your life.
Okay,
Right?
I mean, but you can make an argument that you don't need
So
guns to defend your life.
the right to life is not the same as having the ability to defend your life. I could make the argument that you have the ability to defend your life regardless of if you have a gun or not. Because in society where guns aren't here, then you're supposed to not have guns on either side of either side of either conflict. Of course, there are ways in which people can get guns without it being legal. But if if it was the case, if we could look at two worlds and one world where guns are legal and lots of people are dying despite people having the guns to defend themselves, and another world where guns are illegal and less people are dying, then you are depriving less people to the right to life in the less guns world.
Who gets to make that decision?
According to the Constitution, it seems like the states.
No.
Okay. Wait, so who
Not-
does get to make that decision?
Not according to the Supreme Court. But you know what?
Oh yeah, of
But-
course. I'm not arguing that. I'm arguing that the Supreme Court were being activists when they said that.
You think it should be good, but then California would say you have no right. You have no right to defend your life, right?
Well, you have no right to a gun. They can say you have no right to defend your life. They can say that you have no right to a gun, but you can still defend for your life.
Okay, so what happens, to use your argument about economics earlier, what happens if California says nobody can own any firearms?
And then firearms come from another state.
You'd be okay with that, right? If individuals were not allowed to own firearms and only the government could own firearms, do you see why that's really scary to people? Why the government could come in and just use firearms at their own discretion or whim, that they couldn't just come in a tyrannical way?
Well, hold on. First of all, my interpretation of the Second Amendment requires a well-regulated militia. So the California couldn't say nobody can have arms in their state. They have to have a well-regulated militia in some form or another.
So what happens? You can't. We've decided we can't.
Okay, so I think I completely missed his point on this one. So he's saying that without the Second Amendment being for individuals and only the government, so this entire argument that we're about to go on is kind of irrelevant because it's not even talking to his point, and I'm just now noticing that. He's saying that that it's scary to people that the idea that only the government can have guns. Which is probably true. I'm sure that's true for a lot of people. However, that does not speak to the constitutionality of individuals having the right to bear arms.
We don't have compulsory military service, right? So the
Wait,
government.
hold on. What do you mean by that?
We don't have a draft anymore. It's all
Okay.
voluntary, right?
Okay.
That includes the National Guards. So what happens if the government says that MPU is too far right-leaning? He believes that everybody should have a Second Amendment right. We don't want him in our militia, but we want Cluck. We want liberal Cluck to come in, and he's going to get a gun. I'm not saying whether you want a gun or not, but say California says that only the guy that agrees with
The real answer to this, and I don't give this answer. I think my answers are pretty bad for this next section, if I'm remembering correctly. But the real answer to this is what happens if California decides they want to do that. Well, then you don't get a gun, and I would, I guess. I don't know that political parties are political affiliation is protected under the Constitution as a thing that can't be discriminated against. And what I would say to that is that the Constitution allows that. He's talking about the practicality argument, which is an argument that I like. But if you're going to be a constitutional conservative, the practicality of the matter shouldn't matter so much as what the Constitution says. That's the answer to that question, and I don't give it, and I I don't think I do a good job on this section.
Us politically can have the gun, and the person who doesn't agree with us doesn't get a gun. So therefore, when we want to go after the guy who doesn't have the gun, it's so much easier to send liberal Cluck in with a 22 because who wants to get shot by any gun?
Wouldn't that validate yeah, that word for me.
Invalidate?
No,
Valium?
Violate.
It's Wouldn't it be
Violate.
against the 14th Amendment, the equal protection clause?
Violate.
Wouldn't that violation? Thank you, violate. I don't know why. I took melatonin at 7:30. So
Wait.
huh? What the equal protections clause?
No, if there's no right. Oh, see now you're starting to run
No,
into
no, no, no.
thing.
So
Amendment,
if
Amendment.
wait, hold on. California can't make laws based off of like people's political beliefs.
But if the Second Amendment, according
All
to
right,
the
I'm gonna
definition,
sit
says
in
the states can regulate.
in voice
They
chat
can
for a little
regulate a
bit, see
training
if anyone comes
They can
down.
regulate a training requirement, which
And
is
if I don't
as
get
somebody who
anybody in
believes everyone
15
should have
minutes,
guns,
then
does
I'm
a training
gonna
regimen that they are
sign
requiring
off for
to
the
be able to
night.
have guns.
Does that training regimen require every able-bodied person in California to become a member of the militia, the National Guard? Is that what that means?
Well,
Who pays that?
I guess they would say, well, a well-regulated militia is that if you are, yeah, pretty much, yeah,
Who's well regulated? I think you know this.
well trained.
Okay, so well trained, not like overly restricted. You just think it's just whatever the training is. So whatever the training is, they determined that everybody gets a training is now part of the militia, right? Because if you're not part of the militia, you don't get a gun.
Yeah.
Because you're only training the militia, right?
I mean, that's what the Second Amendment is saying.
Just say yes or no.
That's what the Second Amendment is saying.
Okay, so if California says I want to require everybody to have firearms training before they can own a gun, but I'm going to limit who can be in the militia, can people really be trained to use a gun if only the militia gets to own guns?
Let me think about that for a second.
Yeah. This is where the logic begins to fall apart.
No, that's where the practicality of interpreting the Constitution by its words, a strict interpretation of the Constitution falls apart.
I guess the Second Amendment does allow that.
Okay, so the Second Amendment says California can effectively ban individuals from having a firearm at all. So you have to be part of the National Guard, which is
Well, the Equal Protections Clause would protect people from being denied.
which answers only no man. See, no, because if your interpretation of the Second Amendment says that only California militia members can own a gun after they've been well regulated / trained,
And what conservatives would say about this, if you don't like the way California runs its gun laws, then move to a different state. That's what conservatives will say about that.
and therefore anybody not in the militia is not able to own a firearm. The 14th Amendment would have no sway there because you're talking about two federal amendments. Unless for some reason,
So if you thought that
the
those
14th Amendment trumps the Second Amendment and therefore says
No,
that
no.
everybody
The
must
14th
be
Amendment would trump
So if you
the
don't-
California's desire
so if you-
to keep certain people out of the militia.
Well, you'd have
So
to prove
if
that,
you-
right?
Well,
I mean,
yeah, it
that's-
would
So
go to
if you-
court and everything,
so
but
if
that's
you
the
thought
way
that
I
those-
read it.
So if
What about the people that
so
didn't want to get
so-
the COVID shot that were in the
so-
military were discharged with another than honorable
so-
discharge?
In the
Constitutional-
military?
Yeah, that was for sure a 14th Amendment violation
Why was that a 14th Amendment violation?
because they required you to put something in your body that you didn't want to do.
They already
I-
require vaccines.
Not untested ones. Every vaccine the military
wait.
used to
So does 14th
Every-
Amendment say that you can't
What
require
does the
vaccines unless they've been tested?
every
What does
vaccine
the
that is required by the military before COVID.
Oh my gosh, he hasn't thought about this position. Like, okay, so if you want to say that the COVID-19 vaccine requirement for the military is unconstitutional, you have to absolutely say that the rest of the vaccines that the military requires is unconstitutional also. The fact that the idea that the COVID-19 vaccines were untested, which isn't even true, does not matter to the constitutionality of requiring vaccines.
Well, no, before anthrax, because anthrax was another example of something that was completely fucked up. Every vaccine that was done has been tested for years, okay? And there's years of data on it. The COVID vaccine, we still don't know what that's going to look like from a long-term situation. We know that the VAERS reporting on that is just now starting to come to light. There's a lot of problems with what those vaccines did to certain people. I had two shots and a booster. I refused to get another booster because I've had COVID since then, and Paxlovid worked for me. Right? Good for me. I'm still alive. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. If you guys want to make sure that I stay alive, please consider donating to my Venmo.
Okay.
Back to but you understand what I'm saying?
Well, I don't understand how the 14th Amendment would protect people that don't want the COVID shots, but not protect people who don't want the smallpox shots.
You can do. You used to be able to do
Subscribe to my
religious
channel.
exceptions. There are religious exceptions for
Subscribe to
vaccination.
my
But wouldn't the
channel.
14th Amendment really protect them
Subscribe
regardless
to
of their
my
religion?
channel.
If it protects from
It
COVID shots.
provides that opportunity, right? The idea that a person has sovereignty over their own body. I mean, this is the whole argument, right, that you guys make about the right to abortion, right to choose. It's not right to choose; it's right to kill a baby, right? It's our body, our choice. Until COVID vaccination came out, then it's like you got to do it. You
Wait,
must do it.
Wait, you're not
reason-
answering the point of
the
my
reason-
like.
the
If the
reason-
14th Amendment, if not allowing people in the military because they didn't want a COVID vaccine, is against the 14th Amendment, wouldn't not allowing people in the military because they wanted a smallpox vaccine, they didn't want a smallpox vaccine, also be against the 14th Amendment?
No, I think that's a bit of hyperbole off to the side, which we sort of went off the rails a little bit. My point is that California, if they made a decision
Did.
to not allow people like me into their militia
Did.
so I could own a gun, but allowed you in, and the only difference between us was obviously I'm clearly better looking, but that I happen to be right of center, you happen to be left of center. That would be a problem. But it would be difficult to get that to go through because that's the kind of shit that like the fallible humans that run the federal judiciary might make the wrong case, right? They might make the wrong opinion, and then it becomes law until God knows when, 50 years later, when somebody finally decides to get the shit right. That's my point about 14th
Okay,
Amendment.
so
And usually the Supreme Court won't take the case up
But
unless you
that-
have one court say one thing in one way and another case says
what you're
another.
saying is because the 14th
But-
Amendment didn't protect people who didn't want the vaccine from being kicked out of
But-
the military, which I don't think that the 14th Amendment actually I don't think the Constitution really does the Constitution actually say anything about the military besides common defense?
There's a provision for this pay for the Navy, but not
Okay.
the Army.
But you're saying that the 14th Amendment wouldn't protect you in that case because it doesn't protect against COVID. COVID
No.
vaccines.
You're trying to make a logical leap. That's not what I was trying to make.
That's okay. So
What I'm saying is that people got kicked out, even for religious exemptions, which the Supreme Court has already held under prior precedent that you can't do that. That's why that was just overturned, by the way. Okay, they found that to be unconstitutional. The application that said you must take this COVID vaccine, even under religious grounds of exemption, what do you call it, conscientious objector status, is that you can't make them do it. Now, before when you did these kinds of things, if you couldn't take a vaccine, that meant you couldn't be forward deployed, right? Because there was vaccines that we require people to take if they're going to say Ethiopia or whatever, right? There's different like tropical disease, right, that people require people to take in order to prevent. We took a lot of quinine water, I guess, when you went to Cuba in 1898. But the idea, right, was that there had to be some sort of an accommodation for people who had a religious. That's a First Amendment ground. And the federal government said, no, screw you, you're being kicked out. So that's when I say that there's a 14th Amendment issue, that's a 14th and a First Amendment issue, okay, that the Supreme Court actually just overturned, right? They agreed with the supposition I'm making, that it was a dissimilar treatment of somebody based on their religious value.
okay, so if it's based on your religious value, I can somewhat
And-
understand that.
and-
So, but that would go for like smallpox vaccine also.
There's
That's what I was saying earlier.
there's been people that do religious exemptions,
But
right?
that's only for religious exemptions.
Well, that happens to be one, right? I mean,
Job
look,
at-
when there are things that come up that people don't
job
want to do,
at
they hire lawyers, or lawyers get involved in
keeping in
cases,
check.
and they try to sift through the
Keeping
mechanism by which they think they can
keeping in
posit a case,
Check.
right? Just like that. I mean, that's how the rope case came forward, right? Somebody job shopped that shit around until they found somebody that was willing to make the argument, as weird as it was, and they were able to convince 5 people on the Supreme Court. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't mean it'll stand the ultimate test of time, right? Precedent matters until it doesn't. Does that make sense?
Hold on 3 seconds.
That's where,
I'm holding. What do you
where
got?
I can.
Do I look good on your stream?
You're
That's
not
where
even
I-
on my stream. Your camera isn't.
that's where I-
running.
that's
Why?
where-
Oh,
On
that's
this
because.
one.
where-
Yeah.
that's
Well, your camera's not showing on mine either. I guess I could do it, but I'm lazy.
Yeah.
It's your massive guns. I think would be a problem. My audience would just leave me in droves.
So what I would say is
All
that
three.
let's say
guns.
we got into a
What's he
position
talking about?
where
That's where I can come.
we
in.
allowed states
I'm
to
trying
require
to
a training
stream all
regimen in order
topics-
to bear arms
topics
because that's
like
what the Constitution
this.
says. And then you get denied. And then you get
Let's just say we make it part of the educational curriculum that everybody has to learn how to use a gun. Now, aside from the fact, but that would just cause the left to lose their fucking mind if we were training kids how to use guns.
what I'm saying is that a state has the right to be like, you have to have training for 1 month every year in order to keep and bear arms, and it's got to be in the
What training could you possibly do with normal firearms that requires a month's worth of
a
training?
week, whatever whatever the state comes up with. I think that the Constitution allows for this.
Who's going to pay for it?
I guess the people.
What if the people can't afford it?
Well,
What if
by your logic, they have the
What-
opportunity to get more skills and earn more money, so they can pay for it.
That's true, but what if they can't at that moment? Then therefore they can't own their gun. Their gun would be subject to confiscation, right?
Yeah.
So who pays for the gun when they get confiscated?
The people.
What do you mean the people? No,
The
I own
people
a
who get their gun confiscated.
That's right. I actually looked this up a little bit. The claim he's about to make is government confis property. I actually looked this up, and I think that this next thing he's about to say is just completely wrong.
Confiscated.
I own a gun, and I didn't take the course, so I'm now in violation of some state law. The state comes and says, "Well, you can't have this gun, so I'm going to take your gun."
So
That-
you're,
that-
we're
that-
making,
what? That's a taking. Who pays for that, right? The government cannot take shit from a private citizen without just compensation. So who pays?
What do you mean if you were illegally owning it?
That's not illegally owning it. I owned it legally, but I lapsed in my training.
Oh,
You're saying that I owned a gun legally, and that by operation of some stupid law that says I must maintain a certain number of credits per year in order to maintain ownership, is that not an infringement? Aren't you requiring
there
something?
there might need to be a grandfather clause, the same way it was for automatic weapons before those were banned.
The automatic weapon? You mean the NFA?
Yeah.
You're not talking about the the assault weapons ban, the so-called assault weapons ban.
No. So you know how like fully automatic weapons are illegal unless they are from like before 1980 something?
That's not true. You have to be a Class 3 federal firearms license holder to be able to have an automatic weapon. Automatic weapons are still permitted, but it's not easy to get.
Yeah. So okay, but like in general, like I can own an automatic weapon if it's from a certain time, right?
No, you can't. Well,
I
actually, technically you can because there's two parts to the NFA, 1933, 1934, I can't remember, 33 or 34.
Oh, goodness.
When and that was all in response to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Again, like a shootout among gangsters, right, that hurt civilians. And then the public was so outraged, they demanded that there would be action, and then they just blithely, allowed their rights to be taken away from them by the federal government. There was automatic, roughly speaking, automatic weapons existed before the Revolutionary War.
Never challenged in the past.
And it was totally legal to have them. If you could afford a Gatling gun in 1860, you could have had your own personal Gatling gun, and the government wouldn't do anything about it. When you went to jail because you stole somebody's sheep, and they took your guns while you were in jail, you got out of jail, the first thing they did is they gave you your gun back.
So when automatic weapons became illegal, who paid for?
Unconstitutional. I don't know the history of the confiscation, but they required. Well, they didn't make them illegal. They made them illegal to buy new stuff.
Yeah.
And then they required existing owners to buy a license. They had to get a certification every so often, right? So they made you pay for that. But then, and the federal court said, yeah, that's okay. That's reasonable. They made a bad decision. In my opinion, it was as bad or worse than Dred Scott. But anyway, they said, okay, this is legal for you to do, federal government. And then the federal government, there's two parts. It says, you can't do this unless you have a special stamp, a tax stamp, right? Because the government can tax. And then they turned around and said, well, we're not gonna process these paperworks anymore. And by operation of law, by saying we're not gonna fund this process anymore, and we're not gonna process these permit fees things, then they said, no, you're not going to do it. And they made all these things illegal. And the federal court came back and said, fuck you. Part 2 has been, part 1 or part 2 has been stricken. So they technically can still ban the sale of new items unless you have specific qualifiers. The Gun Rights Act of 1968, that's been amended several times since then, has the provisions for by which this can be done, which includes a Class 3 federal firearms license, okay? You can still do that under very limited, restricted conditions, okay? But the fact that the government is in the business of banning any firearm, period, any weapon, period, is unconstitutional in my original interpretation of what the Constitution says.
Which is that a well-regulated militia being necessary for the free state.
Wording actually means. I get that. I respect that you have a difference of opinion. But if I'm correct, then the NFA and the GRA, the Gun Rights Act of 1968, are both unconstitutional. At the time of the founding of the country, private citizens, not part of the militia, could own mortars. They could own grape shot cannon, right? You know what a grape shot cannon was, right? It's
yeah,
just like
but just because they could doesn't mean that it like states didn't have the right to ban those things if they wanted to.
Nobody banned it.
Yeah, but they just because they didn't doesn't mean they didn't have the right to under the Constitution.
Do you know when the first gun law was actually passed in this country?
I don't.
Okay, well, I don't want to say it without knowing it, so I'm going to say when. I'm going to ask the Google.
Probably 1900s.
Gun restriction passed by Congress.
Wait, hold on a second. Why are you looking up Congress? I'm saying states have this right.
Well, no, hang on. We're gonna look at it both ways. The Federal Firearms Act, the National Firearms Act, National Firearms Act. So the law required the registration of NFA firearms with Secretary of Treasury in 1934. So that was 1934 for the feds.
Way.
What state first regulated firearms ownership in the U.S.? You like that? I said in the use, but I'll just back that up. Okay.
Now,
gun law in the United States, by state. No, firearms, blah, 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 blah. Some states and localities require a person to obtain a license or permit in order, blah, blah, blah. This is all current shit. Localities place restriction on semi-automatic firearms, blah, 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 blah. Firearms, yeah, really, no state did anything before 1934.
Okay.
It looks like, right?
Okay.
But it's amazing how few mass murders there were before 1934. Actually, how many mass murders there were before 1980?
Wasn't there a lot of gun violence during?
Yes. So
yeah, I mean, gang related, sure.
So why would we put a regulation on something until it becomes a problem? Back then, there weren't mass murders the way they are now. But now there are mass murders. And states are trying to ban the weapon commonly used for these mass murders. And it seems like the Constitution allows for that kind of thing. Goodness, this is exhausting.
Sure, there's like mob related shit.
Yeah, so I would imagine it was probably a response to that.
Well, the NFA was for sure,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it came out. It literally came out after, or that act was passed after the St. Valentine's Day massacre.
Okay.
So it was a fucked up response to that problem, right? I mean, would it be far much easier, right, if we simply said that if you use a gun, if you bring a gun to a crime, then you go to jail for 20 years. If you use a gun in a crime and nobody's hurt, you get 20 to life.
We already.
Hang on.
So basically, oh gosh, I'm not even. All right, I'm done. Basically, he goes on to try and talk about how higher sentences for these people that commit these crimes would be the best solution to gun crimes, which is just what person in jail for a gun crime right now thought about the fact that they could go to jail for a gun crime before they committed the gun crime? That's insane. I don't think that adding 20 years to their already 10 to 15-year sentence is going to make people think twice about committing the gun crime. The people who are committing the most gun crimes are usually gangs, and they are committing these gun crimes because they feel like they're engulfed in a culture where they feel like they have to join this gang in order to make it anywhere. And these people they believe this is the only option they have. And they already know they're going to go to jail. They already know they're going to spend a lot of their life in jail. Do you think that making them spend more of their life in jail is going to stop that? And as for mass shooters, they tend to commit the gun crime and expect to die afterwards, and the ones that survive say that they did not expect to make it. Do you think that making a 20-year sentence for these people or giving them the death sentence is going to stop them from committing the gun crimes? No, they already think they're giving themselves a death sentence before they start the crime. This is the dumbest solution to this problem I've ever heard. Take away the tool that people use to commit these crimes. That is a much better solution than what you're putting up. Now, I don't know how practical that is in today's world because there are so many guns on the street. I believe that if we were to have a federal ban on semi-automatic weaponry, there would probably be some kind of pain to that ban at first. But over time, we would probably see less gun crimes overall and less mass shootings. Um, but at first, while we're trying to get all the guns off the street, it will be kind of hell for some people. And that is not a result of the ban. That is a result of the gun culture that we have right now that has allowed so many guns to end up on the street. That is because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you are held up at gunpoint and you have a gun, or if you held up at gunpoint and you don't have a gun. Both instances are traumatizing as hell. And yes, you have a little bit of a better chance to survive if you have a gun, depending on the situation. Sometimes guns can embolden people to make dumb decisions that get them killed, where if they didn't have a gun, they may have survived because they would have made a different decision. We do not have a way of knowing this, but there are scenarios in which I can imagine that is a thing that happens. So this solution is dumb. More jail time for people who use gun crimes is a dumb solution. It doesn't make sense. Anyways, that's my time. Thank you everyone who tuned in for tuning in. I am out of here, and y'all have a good night. Bye bye.